All right, everyone, carrying on where we left off, continuing our analysis of the conversation between Neil deGrasse Tyson and Patrick Bet-David. Let's get right into it.
In a case where you can contaminate someone else, it's not about you. It's about the collective
You're assuming
health.
Something I want to point out that I notice, and I'm not an expert on haptics or facial expressions, body language, that sort of thing, but Neil deGrasse Tyson is very good at making eye contact, connecting with his audience, discussing, being engaged, and he gets very enthusiastic about nerdy information. That's one of the things that makes him a good communicator. And when he's sharing something that he's genuinely excited about, he's engaged with the person. He is locked eyes. He's enthusiastic. But look at the language that he's showing here. He's not making eye contact with Patrick Bet-David when he's saying these things, when he's making his point. It's almost like he has to separate himself from what he's saying. I'm going to wind back 10 seconds. Let's look at it again.
You can put forth that idea. But what I'm saying is, in a case where you can contaminate someone else, it's not about you.
That whole thing, he's not looking at the camera and he's not looking at Patrick Bet-David, which to a gifted communicator, to someone who knows what he's doing, means he's not talking to the audience and he's not talking to his interviewer. He is taking his mind to an abstract place.
It's about the collective.
You're assuming.
And he's still doing it until PBD starts talking, and then he looks.
Health.
You're assuming because somebody can take the vaccine, won't get COVID, which, by the way, I don't need to play the clips for you to see it, where everybody said, hey, if you get it, you're not going to get, if you take the vaccine, you're not going to get a Rachel Maddow, Joe Biden. I can give you Fauci. I can give you, and you've seen these clips before. It's not like you've never seen it before.
Yeah, what happened
They were wrong.
Hold on. So.
One of the signs of someone who's not really trying to get at the truth is that they won't give ground even when you make a good point. Patrick Bet-David is not speculating. What he's doing is bringing up that a variety of people who had the responsibility to be spokesmen during the COVID crisis made the case publicly. They said, if you get the vaccine, you won't get COVID. And then later went on the record on video saying, I was wrong because the science proved out that it may have reduced your risk or reduced your severity, but it did not grant immunity in the sense that there are many, many people who got the vaccine and in the future tested positive for COVID. There shouldn't be a problem with saying, you're right, mistakes were made, or they were wrong. Not even a mistake, because it could be based on the best evidence at that time that it was going to grant immunity, and make it so that you were a terminus for infection, that once you were vaccinated, that it couldn't flow through you anymore. You were immune and you couldn't pass it on. That was the case that was being made early on. You can be mistaken. The process of scientific discovery is to create a hypothesis and observe the results of that hypothesis. The hypothesis being put forth by the scientific community that PBD is referencing is, if you take the vaccine, you won't get COVID yourself and you won't be able to transmit it on to someone else. That is a hypothesis. Then we prove it in the lab of lived experience and we realize that hypothesis was false. It was proved false. That should be okay. If you are pursuing scientific inquiry, that should be a pleasing result at a certain level, because a conclusive, dispositive result is useful scientific information, but it's not politically useful if your goal is to present some kind of political messaging or corrupt or subvert the scientific process to a political end. Political truth does not allow for this kind of genuine mistake. If Neil deGrasse Tyson is being genuine, he should say, yeah, they were wrong. We found out they were wrong, and science improved because of it. Let's see what he says.
The strain evolved, okay, so that the vaccine that prevented you from catching COVID was tuned to the variant of COVID at the time the vaccine was designed, okay? Over time, there were variants that arose. The vaccine provided partial protection against the new variants, enough to keep you from dying statistically, and to basically keep you out of the hospital, allowing other people with more severe problems to get the hospital attention they required. And so then they would develop a subsequent, the booster and a subsequent mixture of the vaccine. This is what happens every year with a flu shot. They look at how the flu has evolved from one season to the next. And what's fortunate is Australia tends to get the variant of flu before we do, because they get their winter in our summer, and then so we study that, have a forward projection for it. So these annual flu shots are precisely out of the same idea of how this occurs.
How long have those been?
This is something I might call chaff, conversational chaff. PBD makes a succinct point. People who were spokesmen during the COVID crisis made a claim and were later proved and admitted that that claim was false, in the sense that it was incorrect. They were wrong. Instead of responding directly and saying, no, they weren't wrong, because you can't argue the facts. The historical record is black and white clear. You can't argue this point on the fact. But it's not politically useful for a leftist to agree with something that damages the left's political operation. So we choose a third option, which is, we'll call it chaff. He throws out that viruses mutate, that vaccines tend to be most effective towards the form of the virus that they were tuned to. Okay. Then he starts talking about flu shots and flu vaccines. Then he starts talking about how winter and summer are different, and so we can use the Australian winter season to help inform our vaccine decisions for the following winter. Okay. All of that doesn't answer the question. All of that is basically filibustering. It's basically saying, hey, would you like to chase off down any of these tangents I'm offering? Because none of them are as damaging as the question that you raised. So let's see if PBD takes the bait or keeps us on point.
Tested though for years. COVID vaccine hasn't been tested for it. It was something we just came out. But let me.
I don't know what point you're making, other than it was tested. You might
9 months is not enough.
You might prefer. No, it's not a matter of time. It's a matter of how many. Yes, time matters, but.
And of course, here we have something beautiful. One, he's still not making eye contact. Two, he is getting kind of bombastic. He's raising the tone of his voice. He's speaking faster, and he's pushing back a little bit, going, I don't know even what point you're making. You're being nonsensical here. And then PBD says, well, here's my point. It was not tested long term. So PBD says, my concern it wasn't tested because it wasn't tested long term. And then Neil deGrasse Tyson says, yes, it was tested, not long term. It's not a matter of time. It's a matter of, I'm assuming he's going to say sample size. He realizes that that's not a very good answer, that's going to get him trouble later in the conversation. And he reverts back and says, oh, let me take that claim back. Time does matter, but ... And what happens when you have a conversation like this is that you end up, one, he's just verbally taken both sides of a position. He's tried to correct himself. If you're arguing in good faith, you're allowed to correct yourself if you slip up. But what he's really trying to do is he's trying to win the argument. He's trying to win the conversation. And again, one of the things I want to point out, the beginning of this conversation, if you know the PBD podcast at all, it's not a very combative podcast. It's just not. It's a fairly open forum. And the question being asked was, what do we know now as compared to what we knew in the middle of the crisis? And there are 100 different ways that you can have a conversation about that that's not combative, that's not a win-lose scenario. There's a bunch of different ways you can take it. Now, maybe he's been under pressure, Degrassi Tyson, in other formats. Maybe he's frustrated. Maybe he's, feeling a little defensive here. But he immediately turns this into a contest and seizes words that PBD is saying and is trying to push for a particular point. And it looks like he's doing it again here.
The number of people is paramount. That's the most important thing. Okay, you don't test it on 10 people. You test it on as many people as you can.
Sure.
And I think it was thousands, but
is it fair
don't
to
quote
say
me.
that some of the side effects we may not know for 5, 10, 15, 20 years? You can't, they can't.
The reason why I suspect a political motive in the way Neil deGrasse Tyson is approaching this conversation is there's no scientific reason to not just say, of course. When you have something new that has never been studied long term, you cannot definitively say what the side effects might be 10 or 15 years down the line. For instance, you don't know, nobody knows, and I'm not going all tinfoil hat, I'm just throwing out a random possibility. If you get the vaccine as a child and it changes something in the way your body eventually goes through puberty, maybe it affects your future fertility. Maybe it affects your future heart function or lung capacity, some of the things we've seen implicated. Maybe it increases your chance of getting a blood disorder or whatever. I'm not a scientist, okay? Just pay attention. The point is, we can't know what the long-term side effects could be of this because there has not been enough time passing. That is a scientifically safe thing to say, but it's not a politically safe thing to say.
Say, we know 100% the side effects 10 years from now. How are you going to know that?
Yeah, okay. So, no, of course, we can't know
So
that.
then all I'm saying is...
Watch.
Hey! He realizes there's nowhere to go, so he agrees. And this is one of the interesting things that you will find when you're talking with leftists. They will agree and then immediately go back on the offensive, or they will agree and then immediately go back on what they just said, or in some way turn it back into a combative conversation. So let's see where it goes.
Can't know that.
Okay.
But watch. So I have a whole chapter called Risk and Reward in the book, which tries to sensitize people to when they make a decision, what kind of risk are they absorbing relative to what they're rejecting, okay? And we're not very good at that, at probability and statistics or analyzing it. That's why TV commercials trying to sell you a product don't just show you data. They show a person speaking of the effectiveness of the product. A single person. I lost 50 pounds. The testimony of an individual should be irrelevant to you relative to the entire set of people who have done it. And you want to look at those statistics, but we're not good at that. And advertisers know that. So they show the testimony of an individual, which is hugely potent in a civilization where we don't think statistically, we think about eyewitness testimony on something. And somehow that is raised to a very high level of influence on our decisions. What I'm saying is, you're not your decision point is not, I'm not going to take the virus because 5 years, 10 years, I don't know what effect it's going to have.
Some may, though. Some may not be comfortable with
Let me
that.
finish the sentence. Okay, so you can say, I don't want to take the virus because 5 or 10 years from now, there could be a side effect that we don't see.
Which is a possibility.
Hold on. I'm trying to make a statistical point here, okay? If you say, I don't want to take the virus because it hasn't been tested for 5 years and there could be some long-term side effect that worries me, okay? In that same moment, there's the risk factor of you getting COVID.
Sure.
Okay? Unvaccinated. At one point, 87% of everyone dying in the hospital of COVID was unvaccinated. Okay, so your risk choice is, I'm not going to take it because maybe somewhere down the line something will happen that we don't know what that is, or I will risk getting COVID. And if I get COVID, depending on your age and other things, there's a 3% chance of me dying in the hospital. That's your choice. Yes. Yes. But what I see people doing is they focus on one thing, and that's the foundation of their decision, rather than the other chance. And what happens if you get COVID? Now you get long COVID. Now you don't have taste buds for 2 years or whatever it is for long COVID.
Yeah.
You're on a ventilator in the hospital, possibly dying. Like what? Where is the? So I looked every day, once a week.
He took a while to make that point, but let's try and distill down the point that he's trying to make in this conversation. PBD is saying, shouldn't a person be able to make that choice of whether or not they want to run the risk of an unknown side effect of the vaccine, or if they want to run the risk for COVID? And fundamentally, that's an individual decision. Neil deGrasse Tyson is saying, yes, that's your decision, but because human beings are bad at risk analysis, you should not make that decision. You're making it wrong. And the establishment knows better. He gets into this a little bit later, but we're going to get a little sneak peek. The establishment knows better how to measure this risk, and therefore we should be able to force you to make the right decision. We can pretend up front that you're free to make that choice. But if you don't make the choice that we like, then we are going to apply ever increasing degrees of pressure until you make the choice that we want you to make, which is not a free society, which is not a society with freedom of speech, with freedom of thought. It's not the American society that's compatible with the Constitution. You cannot build a centralized authority that has the ability to compel these kinds of personal decisions and have that centralized authority be in line with the Constitution. That they are antithetical to each other. I think it's worth saying, we're now 10 minutes into the video, so we're not going to go any further. We're just going to wrap up and conclude. I'm going to do this in 5-minute chunks till we get through the whole video. If you're arguing in good faith, you should be able to articulate both sides of the position. You should be able to be firmly convinced of your own side, but you should be able to offer to the satisfaction of the person you're discussing with it, that you now understand their position and why they have made it. The challenge is Neil deGrasse Tyson as an analog for leftist argumentation is that they are more interested in the end results of the conversation than they are in the process of the conversation. Here's what I mean by that. One, this is he's clearly on a book tour. So that's what prompts a lot of these interviews is they'll go out and they'll try and promote their book. Fantastic. Hey, if you're a thinker and a writer, share your thoughts in the marketplace of ideas. Okay, go ahead, promote. But when you promote it, don't be afraid to be challenged. Patrick Bet-David is challenging him. He's challenging the logic of his position. I think Patrick Bet-David understands Neil deGrasse Tyson's position. I'm not sure that the same is true in reverse. Because what Neil deGrasse Tyson is saying, as someone who has been captured by scientism, by the scientific establishment, is that he is willing to abandon scientific principles, which is the objective pursuit of truth through rigorous analytical study and experimentation. He's willing to abandon those if he achieves the end that he wants. Now, his end might be a good end, or at least good on the surface. For instance, it sounds like he wants people to make better decisions when it comes to weighing risks, pros and cons. He wrote a whole chapter about it in his book, which I haven't read. That's a good idea. That's part of growing up, being an adult, being able to weigh the pros and cons of a decision. That's why 18-year-olds go cliff diving into the water, and far fewer 60-year-olds do the same thing. Because as you get older, you get a little wiser, you realize the risk-reward ratio doesn't make sense, and you say, I'm not going to do that. Okay? That's a That is a laudable goal. However, it appears that he is willing to embrace a centralized, statist, violence if necessary authority in order to force you to make the right choices. And that is completely unacceptable. That is dangerous. And it's fundamentally anti-scientific. That's why it's so difficult for him to engage in what he claimed earlier, is that he's a trained scientist, to engage as a scientist on this topic, because it is things that should be scientifically sound are politically dangerous to the left. So he can't admit those things. We'll carry on as we go forward, but this was part 2. We'll see part 3 in a bit. Cheers.